So first off, thank you for coming out this evening to hear the Charles Fraser Lecture. My name is Jim Spencer. I am the chair of the Department of Planning, Development, Preservation, as well as serving as the Associate Dean of the College of Architecture, Arts, and Humanities. And the real estate program is housed in both of those academic units at Clemson University. Thanks for taking the time. I know that there's a lot of political things going on in Greenville and Columbia and elsewhere tonight. And tonight we're competing with, I think, Donald Trump and a couple of others. So we appreciate your attendance here. And I'm sure that will be much more informative and interesting. It's easy to do the interesting, or it's easy to do the informative. The interesting part, we'll give it our best shot, because it's hard to beat interesting with Donald Trump. So let me just sort of first off say, that's not too much pressure. Okay. Let me first off say thank you to the Charles Fraser family, because without their generous contributions to Clemson, to the real estate program, and to the Planning, Development, Preservation program, none of this would happen. We wouldn't be able to expose our students and our community and our constituencies out there in the world of real estate development to some really great ideas and thinkers and speakers about what we all care about, which is development and communities. One of the things that has always sort of impressed me about the real estate development program here is the real focus and attention to building great communities, because that's what I think really unifies what we're interested in. We want to make a business, we want to make money doing it, but it's really about building communities, about building places where people want to live, where they want to work, where they want to enjoy their lives and raise their families. So in that spirit, I think I've never met Vince, but from everything that Robert has conveyed to me, and I've read up online and talked to others around in South Carolina, he's the perfect embodiment of the spirit of the program and of the department that I think is what kind of captures a niche within a national and international market for this field of real estate. And in that, he's taken a leadership in the private sector and has served in really sort of promoting a lot of the public interests that we all think are important in serving on a number of boards. So in his role as the president of ION in just outside of Charleston in South Carolina, it took me about a year before I arrived, or after I arrived in South Carolina, to actually visit ION at the suggestion of Terry Ferris. And I'm a little bit skeptical of new developments that kind of refer back to kind of this kind of small town type of feeling, but it's really just a beautiful place. And I kind of wanted to move there. It's a little bit of a hard commute, but it was one of those places you walk into and you immediately feel like, this is the kind of life that would be the good life to live. I would like to raise a family here. I would like to enjoy, like coming home from work here. And as president of that, he's taken a leadership role, and I'm proud to sort of welcome him here to Clemson to represent that. Now, one of the great things about building communities is that it also involves the public sector, and Vince has also played a very important role on a number of national boards, and I'll just list them and say a couple of things about them. First, he's a Liberty Fellow, which is the South Carolina has a version of a national program, which is really sort of about public leadership, and that's a great experience. He's been a member of the National Committee for the Congress of New Urbanism, and that's something that we all kind of care about in real estate and planning as well. Perhaps maybe less well known, he's been a national member of the Metropolitan Planning Council for the Brookings Institution Metropolitan Policy Center, which we were just talking about this. I didn't start it. I gave them money to start it when I was at the Ford Foundation in New York back in 1997. And they do fantastic stuff, bringing people like Vince from around the country to really focus on urban areas and development in a kind of urban context. Most recently, and I had to do a little digging on my own to find this out, he's been named as the board chair for the South Carolina Transportation Infrastructure Bank, which as coming from planning, this is such an important role. And to have somebody who really understands the private sector, understands market opportunities, understands the complexity of land development, to actually bring those multiple skills to that important a statewide position in infrastructure funding is really quite an achievement. So with that, I just want to sort of welcome Vince here wholeheartedly and thank him for taking the time to come up here and really sort of share his knowledge and his experience with us. And I will welcome Robert up before that to give some more detail about about Vince's background and how it fits with his the real estate program. So thank you.
Thanks, Jim. Before I introduce our featured speaker, Vince Graham, there are a few folks that I'd like to recognize. Just really pleased that they're here tonight, starting with Charles Fraser's daughter, Laura Lawton Fraser, and her son, Samuel, Charles's widow, and Laura Lawton's mother, Mary Stone Fraser, who is a Greenville native, by the way. We also have a number of members with our Advancement Board for Real Estate Development here as well. If you'll please raise your hand. Thank you, folks, for coming in. And, of course, a number of members from the Urban Land Institute as well. So thank you for coming. I have to take every opportunity that I have to recognize our students and alumni, faculty. So what I'd like to do is have the current MRED students, MRED alumni, Clemson faculty, if you'll just please raise your hand also. Okay, great. Okay, and it's a busy stretch for them right now. You'll hear all about their projects later on from them if you ask them. Okay. Let me also thank Amy Matthews. Amy always does a fantastic job organizing these events, and not only what she's done to help pull this together tonight, but also our Advancement Board meeting tomorrow. So, Amy, thank you very much for what you've done with that. In the acclaimed book, Last Harvest, Arthur Witold Robozinski told the story of a struggling residential development outside of Philadelphia known as New Daleville. Okay? While writing the book, Robozinski decided for his spring break he was going to go to Beaufort, South Carolina. This was the early 1990s. Robozinski had been inspired by the movie The Big Chill and a number of other movies that were filmed in Beaufort. But while he was there, he noticed a full-page ad for a neo-traditional development on Ladies Island known as New Point. And what really caught his attention was the caption in the ad, which said, "They had it right the first time." Okay? So being intrigued, he contacted Vince Graham, the developer. At the time, neo-traditional development was in its infancy. Vince Graham was in his 20s at the time. And interestingly enough, Knox White was just telling me a similar story, that on his trip down, he contacted you and just wanted to come out and see it, and that's how you first met Knox White. Well, New Point led to a number of other pilgrimages from very prominent developers and architects, such as Charles Fraser, Peter Rummel, who was a Fraser protege and at the time was head of Disney's real estate development group, architects such as Robert Stern, Jacqueline Robertson. And in the book, Last Harvest, Robozinski devoted a full chapter to Vince Graham, who he describes as one of the most successful neo-traditional developers in the country. To me, that's somewhat of an understatement. Charles Fraser immediately took a liking to Vince, and that became a lasting relationship for them. Like Charles, Vince inspired a new development model with his adherence to "they had it right the first time." Okay. Well, since the early days of New Point, Vince has participated in building numerous other neighborhoods, including the village of Point Royal, Broad Street, there's Ion, Morris Square, and perhaps his newest, Earl's Court, and Old Village, Mount Pleasant. Jim mentioned the Ion development. That's probably Vince's signature development. We visit it every year with our students, and it's one of the highlights of their mini-semester trip. Vince is a passionate advocate for advancing human-scaled urbanism and has spoken at architectural and planning symposiums globally, Australia, Europe, throughout the United States. He's also been featured on the BBC, CNN, the Wall Street Journal, and National Geographic. He's also very generous with his time and community service, which is something we preach to the students about giving back. Here's someone who not only talks the talk, he walks the walk with that. As Jim mentioned, his newest appointment is highly significant as the new chair of the South Carolina Transportation Infrastructure Bank Board. It's a funding mechanism that's funded over $5 billion in state transportation projects. But what I like about it is here's a gentleman who draws his inspiration from history. He knows how to view land use, bring them together, and I think that's going to serve us well in his new role. Vince, it's an honor to have you with us tonight as the 2016 Charles Fraser Lecture Series speaker. Thanks for coming.
truly is an honor to be here, to meet new people and to be with old friends, the Frasers, and many people I've worked with over the years. Stuart Whiteside is his firm, Seaman Whiteside and Associates, has been with us at ION and other projects, and I went to Virginia, but I feel like I almost have a graduate degree from Clemson because I've spent a lot of time up here. And this is really an inspiring place too. Knox was nice to stop by earlier, the mayor, and it's just what an amazing thing that's been done here. I mean, the Main Street is truly has to be one of the most beautiful main streets in the Southeast. And just the new growth and development, and it's just dynamic, and it's an inspiration. So thank you, Robert and Jim and everyone for having me up here. Mr. Fraser often I would get something written from him or see something that he had written, and he would start with a quote. It was usually provocative in some way. So I thought I'd start with a quote. This is from James Jarmusch, who is a movie director. He said, "Nothing is original. Steal from anywhere that resonates with inspiration or fuels your imagination. Devour old films, new films, music, books, paintings, photographs, poems, dreams, random conversation, architecture, bridges, street signs, trees, clouds, bodies of water, light, and shadows. Select only things to steal from that speak directly to your soul. If you do this, your work and theft will be authentic. Authenticity is invaluable. Originality is non-existent. And don't bother concealing your thievery. Celebrate it if you feel like it. In any case, always remember what Jean-Luc Godard, sorry about that French pronunciation, said. It's not where you take things from, it's where you take them to." And I think this could have been said by Mr. Fraser, because that's how he was. He would look for things, inspiration from everywhere, devour it, go through his fantastic mind, and then he would adapt it for how we live today. I would try to, on the way up here, I was listening to some of the previous speakers, and my first thought, like that, I listened to David Rawl, and I was like, oh no, I should have prepared more. Because, he's so smooth and articulate and polished, and I'm not even going to come close. And then there were Wyman and Laura Lawton's wonderful presentation, just full of emotion and all about growing up with their dad. I'll tell a little story about my first meeting Mr. Fraser and his influence on me. I came to Beaufort from Georgia, actually, to work for Jim Light and Jim Chafin at Spring Island, who had been his employees back in the heyday. And before I came down, I had a mentor in Atlanta, a guy named Al Thompson, who was from South Georgia. Tall, lanky guy. He'd played tight end at the University of Georgia, and he'd known Mr. Fraser at Georgia. And so he said, Vince, when you go down there, you need to look up my old friend Charlie Fraser. He used to come to history class, and he'd roll out these charts of all this swampland in South Carolina and talk about what he was going to do with it. We thought he was crazy, but he actually turned out to be pretty successful. So anyway, he introduced me, and of course I would have met him through Light and Chafin. And, everyone knows his background and how genuine and generous and gracious, just welcoming me in. And all the Frasers, actually, it felt so much at home, this Georgia boy, and the welcome to South Carolina that I received. He was, and the theme of my presentation here is really going to be provocation. And I think that's what he did so well. I was listening to some of the presentations, and people would talk about how, well, he would just, he'd get a hold of an idea, and he'd put people on a plane and fly them somewhere and, explore it and let them experience it and show it to them. And I didn't get to go on those rides, but he was always provocative with me. And one of the things that early on that he encouraged me to do was go study Savannah, the squares around Savannah. And while you're there, go look up, Mr. Shaver at the Shaver's bookstore on this square and sit down with him and tell him I told him to come see you and, get this book and here's some other books and what have you been reading? And it's just challenging constantly. I think if he did that with everyone I was aware of, if he saw that you were genuinely interested and curious, and I mean, he would not let you rest. He would provoke you. And this, I gave a talk. I was invited up to Clemson, and about 5 years ago, I think it was, Robert, and I was fortunate enough to come. And I gave a talk. It's called Radical. I think it was called Radical Charles Frazier or something like that. And what would he do now? And by radical, I think he was radical, and radical in the sense that if you look up that radical in the dictionary, the first definition of that word is of or related to the root. It's from the Latin radix, where we get radish and radiate, radiant. He was always doing that. The other thing, the definition that we're familiar with is completely new and different. He was that too. But he would really encourage me to really look where what is the root of things. And so I've done that ever since. Really tried to understand why we live the way we do, what impacts the environment, all these kind of things. So as Robert and Jim said, I was recently honored to be Governor Haley's appointee as the new South Carolina Infrastructure Bank chair. And I am still in the process of, I've never done anything like this, and I'm still in the process of listening and learning. But I'm trying to understand the history and get to the root of get to the root of things here. So I've taken a deep dive into transportation history, and that's what I want to talk with y'all about today. And I want it to be more of a conversation because we got a lot of experience and really smart people in this room. So if you want to, at any time, please just stop me, raise your hand, let's talk about a point, okay? Is that a deal? We all do that? Stuart? Okay. So this year, 2016, is the 100th year anniversary of the first federal highway bill, when the federal government got into the transportation business. Woo! Everybody excited about that? No? Bunch of conservative people. Anyway, so this was a means, this bill was set up to funnel federal funds to the states to fund automotive infrastructure. It was a watershed event because prior to this time, the infrastructure had typically been funded by either the locality, the town or the city, or it was privately done. Think of trains or streetcars. The state might have been involved some, the federal government not at all. And so this was a watershed event. And if you think about transportation in the context of the history of transportation in context, and if you look at you compare the 100 years since this bill was passed with the previous 100 years, look at the previous 100 years in which you had steamships and trains and bicycles and streetcars and subways and automobiles. You had all this innovation, right? Pretty rapid. Last 100 years, yes, our cars are much more powerful. We got great sound systems. They're safer. They're more comfortable. But they're really, when you think about it, they're the same steering wheel, 4 tires, and internal combustion engine that Henry Ford was building 100 years ago. We have not innovated like we did before. And I think part of the reason is because of this federal underwriting of this automotive infrastructure. Not only did it crowd out other forms of transportation choice, Greenville used to have an awesome streetcar system that was privately run. So you crowded out these other means of transportation, and you also crowded out innovation. So these are the kind of things I'm looking at. So we ask ourselves, I've asked the other board members, so, I understand we've got to widen this road and do all these things, but do we want to continue to perpetuate this vision that's very expensive, it's got a lot of problems associated with it, to the detriment of innovation, or do we want to explore other types of transportation? I put together this list, kind of a 10 notable shifts in urban patterns over the last 100 years related to transportation. And I'm not going to read through all this list. Amy said she could distribute this presentation for those who'd like to see it. So I'm not going to read all the words. There's a lot of slides in here with a lot of words on them, but I'm not going to read them. I won't bore you with that, but they'll be good reference tools if you'd like to look back. But 10 things I'll go over. It's also, I should say, that this is 2 weeks after they passed that federal highway bill. The first comprehensive zoning ordinance ever in the country was passed. New York City, 1916. So these have had dramatic impact. Zoning and the transportation, the way we build infrastructure, has had a dramatic impact on the way we live. For example, Charleston. This is a picture from a map from the Post and Courier from early December. This is comparing the city of Charleston when Mayor Riley first took office 40 years ago with what it is now. It went from about 7,000 acres to 72,000 acres. Grew 10 times in size. That's just the city of Charleston. This kind of shows, as I just mentioned. Now, Mayor Gilliard, who became mayor in 1959, he was the one who first started annexing property on the other side of the Ashley River to the west. And then Mayor Riley ran with that. So the population of the city has gone up, but actually the population of the peninsula, the old city, has dropped. Oh, I can see it right here. I don't have to look at it. And this is kind of an elephant in the room. The land area has grown much faster than the population, and the population density today is fairly low. So here is Charleston in 1920, again, just the peninsula, and here it is today. Charleston is bigger than Washington, D.C. and Boston combined. It is bigger than 10 countries. That's how big it is. And it has a population density that's lower than Detroit. So maybe something to be a little concerned about. And I should say that I think that one of the reasons why that is because of the structure of our transportation system here in South Carolina. We've got the fourth largest system in the country. Texas is bigger, Virginia, and North Carolina. And we've got 54% of the total road mileage in South Carolina is within the DOT system. And I don't know why that is, why North Carolina and Virginia and South Carolina all together are the ones that have that same structure where most of the road mileage is within the DOT system. I don't know if there was like a consultant who went around during the Depression and told everybody to consolidate. I don't know. I'm still trying to figure that out. But we have this consolidated system. So most states have they have county roads and municipal roads where the locals take care of the roads. But here we consolidated it all so it's concentrated at the state level. And I think what happened, one of the reasons why Charleston mushroomed like this is because the municipality could reach out and annex land down Savannah Highway or up on Daniel Island or up on Canehoy or James Island, but they didn't have to be responsible for the maintenance of those roads, right? Because all these people in Greenville would be responsible and the rest of the state. So you remove this discipline that's imposed by geography. We'll get into more about that. You also had boundaries. We used to have boundaries around town, right? This is Boundary Street in Beaufort. It was served as the physical boundary beyond which we didn't extend utility lines. And you still see this in Europe. This is a little town in Greece, Arahova. It's like this is, the sign that says Arahova city limits now entering. And then when you leave, there's another sign, Arahova not. And you're immediately into the countryside. So you have these cities that are fairly compact in the countryside. All over Europe, you still see this way. They didn't extend water and sewer indiscriminately into the countryside. Another pattern that used to be commonplace is the cities were networked. You had street networks, street grids oftentimes, but a network. It might be cranky or organic, but you had these networks so that there are many ways to get from place to place. And I have this little math game many of you have seen, but I'll show again, just to demonstrate the power of a street network. Say you have a point A and B with a single road connecting. There's one way to get from A to B, right? Let's add a second road. Well, now there's two ways. Now, we're going to add a third road, but this time a caveat that you can only move in one of two directions. You can't double back. Well, now there's three, right? The first two and then that third one. There's the third one. If you bisect it again, now there are six. There's the first three, there's four, there's five, there's six. So there's 6 unique ways to get from A to B without doubling back, to keep it simple, without doubling back. So the equation for that is a factorial equation that you might remember from high school algebra. X plus y factorial divided by x factorial over y factorial, where x is the north-south blocks and y is the east-west block. So you have x2 and y2, 2 plus 2 factorial is 4 times 3 times 2 times 1 over 2 times 1 times 2 times 1. Do the math, 24 over 4 equals 6 possible ways. Okay, y'all have the formula now, right? You ready? Okay, now imagine a street network of 10 blocks by 10 blocks. Now that y'all have the formula, somebody quickly tell me what the number of ways is from A to B. Yes? Lots? There are, do all the math, there are 184,000 possible ways to get from A to B. You think about other networks, computer chip. The way they get more powerful is you keep getting more transistors on a little chip. And so that increases the power. Cellular networks, all kind of things. And that's what you typically had. And this is important because if there are many ways to get from A to B, the streets can be very small. People have been talking about this for a long time. Jesus said in the end of the Sermon on the Mount, enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. And I suggest if you ever get in a battle with a traffic engineer and you're trying to argue for more narrow roads, you need to throw this out there because it's important. But it speaks to this. It's not readily apparent that this would all work, but it does work. It does work really well. This is, back up, this is what I call the Carolinas' first neighborhood. This is that section of the Charleston Peninsula where that was once the walled city, bound by Meeting and Bay, Cumberland, and Water Street. It's about 62 acres that was the walled city. There it is today on the peninsula. Now compare that with a more conventional subdivision. This is in Mount Pleasant. That's the overlay of the Carolinas' first neighborhood. You can see how many you can fit, right? And the problem, instead of the street network, you have this kind of dendritic tree-like system so that all the traffic comes into one spot. And we do this 100 times on US 17, what happens? It's a nightmare, right? There's still only one way to get from A to B. So you have to keep having these big, wide roads. Mixed use, y'all know about that. So how do we get here? How do we go from how we used to build neighborhoods and cities for thousands of years up until the last 100, what led to the shift? Well, we'll go back to 1786. After the Revolutionary War, these four gentlemen, together with some other heroes of the Revolutionary War in South Carolina, formed a company called the Santee Canal Company. They got a charter, and the idea was to dig a canal from the headwaters of the Cooper to the Santee River and thereby shorten the route. So instead of river traffic coming all the way down the Santee out in the ocean and then back into Charleston, they could cut it short and it'd be a more direct route. There was a canal craze going on. It was in Britain, and so we brought it over here. Everybody wanted to build a canal. So they started to build a canal. And one of the first things they did after setting up the company is Moultrie wrote to Washington, his Army pal, because he knew that Washington was engaged in the same thing up on the Potomac River. And he asked Washington for a favor. He knew he had this hotshot engineer, kind of like Stuart Whiteside of the day. Then he wanted to bring him down to help them choose the route, make sure the route was okay. So Washington wrote back and he said, he's the guy, but he's not working for me. He's working on another canal in Maryland, but I'll see what I can do. And he pulled some strings, and they got this engineer down, and he met with the project engineer for the Santee Canal Company, John Senf. And he came to the board of directors at the meeting with a cost estimate of $233,000 to build this canal, which in today's dollars would be just over $3 million. So they set about raising the money. It was a private venture, state wasn't involved. But a month later, Rutledge, who was vice president of the South Carolina Company, or the Santee Canal Company, was part of the four-man delegation that went to Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention. There he is back there. He actually figured very prominently. He was chairman of the Committee of Detail that halfway through came up with the first draft of the Constitution. He assembled all the different plans and all the debate, incorporated that into the first draft. Toward the end of the convention ended September 16th or 17th, I want to say. Toward the end, they were talking about Article 1, Section 8. This is the famous enumerated powers section of the Constitution, the congressional powers. And they were having this conversation, and Franklin, who, by the way, a lot of these guys were heavily invested in land speculation, right? There was no stock market back then, so if you had any money, you were investing in Western lands. Washington was a big land investor, as was Franklin. And so Franklin proposed that one of Congress's powers be that they be authorized to provide, fund for the cutting of canals where deemed necessary. This is Roger Sherman from Connecticut. He shot back. He didn't think that was a good idea to tax everybody in the country to fund a piece of infrastructure that would primarily be used by the locality. So they had this debate, back and forth. I think what he was really identifying, Sherman, is this idea of what a lot of economists call moral hazard. When you have more information, if you are in a situation where you're in a position to offload your risk to someone else, the consequences of your decision, then you enter into a situation that's morally hazardous. I'll explain it here. It has to do what your behavior is under different circumstances. So, how likely are you to walk across this wire? What if there's money? It's a little more tempting, but you still don't want to risk your life, right? But if there's someone standing under you with a net, then you might be more willing to do that. So it's moral hazard, and we'll talk more about this. Anyway, this is just a reference. You can look back, but this is the debate. You had a lot of Virginians who were pushing, and Pennsylvanians who were pushing Franklin's motion that Congress have this power, and these old salt New England guys who were pushing back. The arguments in favor: Wilson of Pennsylvania, infrastructure could be a source of revenue. Madison said, you could grant charters to remove natural objects and ease communication between states. And some of the arguments against, I mentioned Sherman's argument. King of Massachusetts thought it would be divisive. It could lead to the establishment of a national bank. It could serve commercial interests by enabling the establishment of monopolies. So anyway, so remember, John Rutledge, Vice President of the Santee Canal Company. How does South Carolina vote on this issue? How many people think South Carolina voted in favor of Franklin's motion? It's kind of self-serving, it makes sense. How many against? A few. Actually, South Carolina voted against with the majority. Hopefully, I like to think it was on the basis of principle. But that motion failed. So Congress does not have the power to fund infrastructure. Two important things, as I said, they don't have the power to fund infrastructure or decide where it could go. And the founders did not intend that earlier in the debate, I didn't get into this, but earlier in the debate, they had talked about the Commerce Clause, Clause 3. And there was no, if they hadn't had this, if they had settled that, they had agreed that Congress had the power, the powers under the Commerce Clause, and I'll get back to that. But that's very important, as you'll see, but they wouldn't have even had this debate about infrastructure if they thought that somehow the Commerce Clause enabled them to fund that infrastructure. Anyway, the South Carolinians go home. They build the first Summit Canal in the country. Inspiration for the Erie Canal and a lot of other successes around the country. Great success. It was the engineering marvel of its day, all done with private money. Now, fast forward to Madison's administration. So there were, between Washington's time and Buchanan's time, there were 53 presidential vetoes. 21 of those, 40%, were over infrastructure appropriations. The presidents kept saying, no, 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 this is unconstitutional. When Madison vetoed, Jefferson was cheerleading from the sidelines. He was no longer president, but he was cheering him on. These are the list of the vetoes, and there's wonderful, actually, that I think the presidents really seem to care more about their oath of office and preserving the Constitution back then, because when they would veto, they would have these long legal treatises about why they were vetoing it, why it was unconstitutional. And they're remarkable. They make for really interesting reading. Buchanan was one of the last to veto over infrastructure. Here's just an excerpt of his veto message. And his concern, the body itself must necessarily be converted into an arena where each would endeavor to obtain from the Treasury as much money as possible for his own locality. It's precisely what Sherman was concerned about. So in all these 8 presidents leading up in that span of time, vetoed legislation. So then what happens in 1860? We talk about doubling the import tariff. That was the only source of revenue at the time for the federal government. Some land sales, but mostly revenue. The Republican Convention in 1860. It's a 17-point platform. Number 12, you hear, sometimes you've heard this about the lead up to what caused the Civil War. You never talk about, and sometimes people say that it was the imports, this tax battle. They never talk about what the money was going to be used for when they increased the tariff. Well, it's spelled out right here in the Republican campaign platform. They were going to increase the tariff to build infrastructure that benefited northern industry, interestingly enough. They're basically just going to dismiss what all those presidents had to say and, let's go forward and get the federal government involved. And also build a transcontinental railroad. So Lincoln was a dark horse candidate. You may or may not know he was a high-powered corporate attorney representing railroads, and he was the candidate. He wins. South Carolina secedes, followed by the other Deep South states. New York almost seceded. I don't know if y'all knew that. New York City was going to secede and form its own country. But anyway, they seceded, and they went on. In one of his last acts as president, Buchanan signs the bill to double the import tax. Meanwhile, what had happened is the Confederate government had been formed, the Confederate States of America, and a South Carolina attorney, Christopher Memminger, showed up at the Constitutional Convention there with a draft copy of the new Constitution, which was basically a Constitution 2.0. They wanted to remove some of the vague language. And for example, in the preamble to the Constitution, they took out the words general welfare, because that was kind of, what does that mean? People were driving trucks through that hole. But this is the really interesting one. Back to Section 8, Article 1, Section 8. And the Confederates said that they made it very clear what taxes could be used for, and they made it absolutely clear that in no way could funds be used to subsidize infrastructure to benefit industry. So it's kind of this anti-corporate welfare clause. And they made some others. They did make an exception for maritime infrastructure, but they said the ships had to kind of pay a toll to do that. So anyway, this is what we this makes for interesting reading if you want to go back to this. So this Constitution was ratified 1 week after Lincoln took office. Essentially what they were doing, without a central government to fund, they were creating a free trade zone in the South. And so this didn't sit well up north. It had just doubled their import tax. And almost immediately you started getting these editorials in the northern press saying, there's no way we can let this happen because all the trade is going to go from Boston, Philadelphia, and New York to Charleston, New Orleans, and Savannah. We can't let this happen. So this is, people don't really talk about this, but this is part of that battle of infrastructure funding that I've kind of dug up. Skip over this here for now. This is a interesting point that a Northern historian made, writing about the Civil War. While so gigantic a war was an immense evil, to allow the right of peaceable secession would have been ruin to the enterprise and thrift of the industrious laborer and the keen-eyed businessman of the North. That would have been the greatest calamity of the age. War was to be less feared. So this has basically shifted. There's two fundamental visions of governance in America. There's the Jeffersonian vision, decentralized, states' rights, local rights, versus the Hamiltonian vision of consolidating all the power in the middle. So this was the big shift. Hamilton won, Jefferson lost. And these are just some interesting paintings from that period right before the war started. You see, it's interesting, you see everybody's kind of on foot or horseback or in wagons. After the war, well, we're going to ride that train that the federal government gave all the land to build. Connected the Intercontinental Railroad in 1869. Soon after, there was a huge scandal, a lot of grift and just scandal related to the infrastructure there. So I'm going to take you through this quickly now. That at the end of toward the end of the 1800s, there were several key Supreme Court decisions that reinterpreted the Commerce Clause so that Congress could be enabled to get involved in infrastructure funding. Y'all can go back and read these if you'd like. But anyway, again, we're building up to the 1916 here. So this was King Street in 1902. This private streetcar system, as I said, you had one in Greenville. There are a lot of them all over the state. Spartanburg, Columbia, Sullivan's Island, Isle of Palms. But what the kind of a catalytic event was over the Panama Canal. We tried to work out a treaty with Colombia, but they wouldn't. The Senate of Colombia wouldn't ratify it. So we helped Panama secede from Colombia, and then we entered a treaty with them and bought the canal zone and the amenities from, or the infrastructure from, and work in progress from the French. There's a guy in Illinois representing himself who sued the U.S. Treasurer of the time, Shaw. And in a case, a landmark case, Wilson versus Shaw, the court asserted that Congress does have the ability to construct interstate highways. So it was a reinterpretation of what originally happened. And that paved the way. I should say, too, that, back to, on the ground here, nothing really moved very fast in cities in the early 1900s. You might have a team of horses that carried a fire engine to a fire, but nothing moved very fast on cities. This was King Street in 1910. Then in 1913, you had two acts passed, the Internal Revenue Act, setting up the income tax, and the Federal Reserve Act. So you had these sources of income for the federal government, and that was followed by the first Federal Highway Act. Still slow speed, though, but then it started to change. After World War I, it was recognized oil became a key component, strategic product to war. It was recognized as that after World War I. But again, you look at this picture of New York, Union Square, and you see the streetcars, and you see a lot of cars, but everybody walking in the street. At this time, everyone, the common law was that everybody had equal ownership of the street. When you went to get on a streetcar, it wasn't next to the sidewalk. You walked into the middle of the street. Everybody had common ownership of it. But this didn't work for the car manufacturers. So they had to change the vision of what a street was for, the attitude toward it. Henry Ford said, they were getting all these cars. The Model T was hugely popular, and more people could afford it, and they were cluttering up the street. So Ford said, we're going to solve the city problem by leaving the city. And you had presidents involved, kind of a lot of early kind of crony capitalism. The Federal Aid Road Act of 21 provided matching funds to states to build automotive infrastructure. Thomas McDonald was the chief of the Bureau of Public Roads from 1919 to just after World War II, 1946, I believe. Just to put it in perspective, this is the route map of the Charleston streetcar line in the 1920s. In 1921, the ridership on the streetcar line was 15 million. So last year, the ridership on the whole CARTA system in Metro Charleston was less than 5 million. But not a lot of people had a car, and you really didn't need one. You just got on the streetcar. Meanwhile, in Europe, Corbusier is advancing his vision of a contemporary city. Now, this was before there was such a thing as an interstate highway system, but this was his vision of the contemporary city. And he thought building this way could be a good economic tool, because you can, increase consumption of goods and sell those goods. Meanwhile, what was happening on our city streets is the fatality rate was just going through the roof, particularly on the streets, on the city streets, because, as I said, the street belonged to everybody. Kids would play in the street, and there weren't really any rules. They would kind of invent the rules as they went along about the streetcar. They would actually build, how you sometimes see these monuments to the war dead in a park? They were building monuments in the middle of streets in big cities to the children who were killed in the street each year. So there was a lot of blowback against motorists and car manufacturers and others. And so those who were engaged and working for those companies, they thought, well, we got to get involved and change the attitude about what a street is for. And that's pretty much what they did. A jaywalker, we know that term, right? Well, originally a jay was kind of a country bumpkin come to town. And when he would walk along, he would kind of look up at the tall buildings and then the store window and bump into you. That was a jaywalker. Well, they changed the definition of that to be someone who didn't cross at the right place. So just a quote from Harding in the early 20s, talking about the federal government's involvement, rapid increasing involvement. This is a cartoon from the St. Louis Star, if you can read that. This is the reckless and vicious drivers holding up a bowl full of children to the car. There was a lot of blowback, significant blowback. And vehicle miles traveled was spiking at this time. You know, you had the cheerleaders like Thomas, we got to build more roads. We got to take care, like he had Ford's strategy. We got to solve this congestion problem by increasing the supply of asphalt. That was the solution. Meantime, the public relations industry was taken off. Walter Lippmann, Edward Bernays, these people, the pioneers of public relations, and Paul Mazur, the problem during the 20s was overproduction. So we had to figure out how to consume all this stuff. Well, we'll use public relations to get people to buy more stuff. You know, we'll convert wants into needs. That was a big thing, this emphasis on consumption. A quote from a journalist here. Change has come over our democracy. It is called consumptionism. The American citizen's first importance to his country is now no longer that of citizen, but that of consumer. So we're completely changing the environment. Edward Bernays, I just mentioned, he was a nephew of Sigmund Freud and an early pioneer. He wrote this book, Propaganda. This is the opening sentence. Now, this was before propaganda. This was before the Nazis kind of made it a bad term, but it used to be considered, you know, that's a reasonable term. You're going to propagate what you like, what you consider good. This is the opening sentence of that book. And this was a book, actually, Bernays was kind of dismayed. Later on, he learned that Goebbels kept this book on his bedside table. But this was, you know, the car was becoming more and more part of our life. You know, it was just, it was even used in presidential campaigns. This is when Franklin Delano Roosevelt was governor of New York. Robert Moses, who was the famous kind of infrastructure czar of New York City for 50 years in the 20th century. This is at the Jones Beach State Park opening. And just another quote from Hoover when he was president, talking about the importance of the automobiles to the economy. This is Broad Street in 1932. So then everybody got infatuated with what was going on in Germany, because Germany was building this thing called the Autobahn, and no one had ever seen anything like it. Fascinated with it. And Hitler came to power in 1933. They started ramping up the Autobahn program. In 1934, this World Road Association, it used to be called the Permanent International Association of Road Congresses, held its conference in Germany. And all the friendly people were there hosting it. And this is Hess, you know, talking about this was a key part of the National Socialist Revolution. Mentions that this is Fritz Todt, who was Hitler's chief engineer, who was head of the Autobahn program. Talked about they had gotten inspiration from some of the road building in America, but no one had done anything like this. So people were totally enamored. Now this is the closing conference. Goebbels invited the delegates to tea. So he's having a tea party for everybody going away. You know, his closing remarks to those assembled, which included the U.S. delegation from all these different institutions. This is Lawrence Hughes, who was number 2 behind Thomas McDonald at the U.S. Bureau of Public Roads, thanking them profusely for this inspiration. So they went home, and we're in Depression, so we thought, well, this is a cool idea. We'll put people to work. We'll build more roads. We'll ramp this up. This is Harry Hopkins. We'll spend and spend, tax and tax, elect and elect. And Tugwell, Roosevelt's director of the Resettlement Administration. My idea is to go just outside centers of population, pick up cheap land, build a whole community, and entice people. Then go back into the cities and tear down whole slums and make parks of them. So we're establishing the vision here. We're creating the vision. The American planners are still enamored. You know, they'd go back. They kept going back. We kept going back and forth. Thomas McDonald would go visit with Hitler, back and forth throughout the Depression. Here's after he came back from one of his visits, his speech he gave at the American Automobile Association in 1936, applauding the Nazis' effort. But this is our situation in cities, is we had a lot more cars than they did, and we had all these Model Ts, and we were clogging up the city street. So the solution, again, became we're going to solve the city problem by leaving the city. We're going to start building these roads to get people out of here. And we can use it to create employment. We must think about the social possibilities. And then Roosevelt signed the Federal Aid Road Act in 1938. This was the kind of the big act that said, let's have our own interstate highway system. Let's start working on that. Meanwhile, Ford was getting awarded, the Grand Cross from the Nazis. And, Cartwright, who was the chairman of the House Committee on Roads, was praising the superhighways. We can do better anything than Germany can do. Not connecting the fact that we're this vast country of low density, and Germany is relatively small, the size of the Carolinas and Georgia, and fairly compact. Someone missed that small issue of scale. They came forward, McDonald and Fairbank, as number 2, came forward with this report. I think this was in early 1939. Here's the kind of vision, and throughout the, they've got these little images throughout that report. See the big highways going, bisecting our cities. This is another image. So the vision, let's put forth the vision. And we'll use this as kind of our urban renewal program to tear down these old slums. This was the highway map that was in part of that Toll Roads and Free Roads report, an early map of the interstate system. Roosevelt put that forward and recommended its approval in 1939. And 3 days later, he goes and opens up the World's Fair in New York, where the General Motors had commissioned the Futurama exhibit about what the world was going to look like, in the future. And so here's some images of the exhibit. Millions of people went through this exhibit, and everybody got this little badge to put on at the end of it. It was built by Norman Bell Geddes, who was a Hollywood set designer, an industrial engineer. And again, this, the idea was that you would extend the commuting radius and people would consume more stuff, that Corbusier idea. More in 1944, another report during World War II, just more images of what it would be like. And so toward the end of the war, Thomas McDonald was speaking before the House Committee on Roads and said, everyone is waiting to the close of war to get in a car and go someplace. The oil and automobile had been key to our victory in World War II, like in World War I. And toward the, just before he died, a few months before he died on Valentine's Day, 1945, this was a critical meeting when Roosevelt met with King Ibn Saud on board the USS Quincy and pledged support and protection for Saudi Arabia. This was the key event, a key event. So go through the Truman years. Eisenhower became president. This was a big, the presidents used to have these annual safety meetings. We don't have them anymore, but they used to do it every year because all these people are dying on expressways. And here he says in the last 50 years, we've had more fatalities than all the wars combined in the last 177 years. He reminds people that in 1975, they're projected to be 80 million cars, but we don't want to stop that. We need to build more highways to accommodate them. So when he gave that speech, there had been about 1 million fatalities in the United States, and in the next 50 years, over 2 million. That's the average since 2012. So the average per year over the total time. But we passed the Interstate Act in 1956. The professed objective was to disperse our factories, our stores, our people, in short, to create a revolution in living habits. It was the largest public works project in the history of the world. Anyway, shortly after they passed it, they started widening US 17, just outside of Charleston, Savannah Highway. This is what it used to look like on July 11th, and then they started bulldozing the trees and to widen it to 5 lanes. In 1957, they announced that rather than in 26, 15 miles north of Charleston, we're going to extend it right into the heart of the city, right into it. These are some examples of projects that were done on the peninsula. You know, again, the vision, we got to get these people moved out, move in and out. It's all about the automobile. And I'm not an automobile hater. I want to let you know, I'm not. But I think this emphasis on this infrastructure at, you know, everything else, you know, who cares, is an issue, is a problem. Crosstown Expressway bisecting the peninsula. Another road, Lockwood Drive, being built on the peninsula. It would speed traffic into the city. These are final plans announced for that intersection of 26 and 17. Just for perspective, these are 4 large projects on the peninsula that have been built in the last 40 years or so. Big interchange at the Ashley River Bridge, at the James Island Connector at Lockwood and Calhoun. The Spaghetti Junction at the end of the Ravenel Bridge, y'all been through probably, and that connection to 17 and 26. And I'm talking about Charleston because I know I live there and know more about that, but a lot of the same thing happened all across the United States. So if you take that in context, those 4 big projects are larger than the area of the Charleston Peninsula south of Broad Street. And you compare that with the waterfront park and you see where the priorities have been. Right? We got to accommodate the movement and storage of automobiles. It was almost like cities were under attack with this. And we began to recognize this, you know, for all his faults. Now, I admire Bush for saying this, admitting that we actually have a problem here. The first thing you got to do is acknowledge a problem before you can do anything about it. But it's all part of our politics. This is so much part of our politics. Oil, keeping the oil flowing, automobiles, you know, it's a big part of it. And not only do we build infrastructure for the private operation of automobiles, but we bail out the automobile companies, right? It's like a priority. And we're all about shovel-ready projects. It's the same kind of Depression era, put people back to work by building more roads. And it's not just here, it's internationally. So, this is the kind of thing I'm trying to get my head around, this kind of cultural vision about advancing the automobile, about federal involvement in the infrastructure building. And it's interesting, but again, this is the kind of thing that I think, you know, I'd love, I miss him so much, but if Mr. Frazier was here to talk about this, because he so much loved history, and again, trying to get to the root of it. What is it about it? It's important to know where you've been in order to understand where you are and where you might want to go. I'll end with a positive slide about how we've changed and, you know, shifted the thinking in some ways. This is the 2 approaches to the State House in Columbia. So that is my talk. I don't mean to be dour about it because I think there are, you know, tremendous things to be excited about. I feel like in South Carolina, you know, we've had, historically, we've been a leader in transportation. Now, I mean, who's here now? We've got Boeing, we've got Volvo, BMW, Mercedes. Google is in the transportation business. We should be a leader in innovating in transportation, and I think we can. We've got a lot of smart people in this room, a lot of great leaders. I mean, look out the window here at this, is what was done on Main Street. It's amazing. So I hope that was provocative. Appreciate your listening, and I'm happy to take any questions.
What do you think of the driverless car? Does that help or hurt?
You know, it's a great question. I don't know a lot about it. Some people, are y'all familiar with the driverless, these autonomous vehicles? I mean, some people, a lot of smart people are saying it's going to be here before you know it. It has I don't know if it helps or hurts, to be frank with you. It could, I can see, I mean, some predictions have been that, in 10 or 15 years' time, you won't want to own a car, because you'll just call up, on your smartphone, and a driverless car will come by and take you wherever you want to go. And then it could reduce the American automobile fleet to about 20% of what it is today. So it frees up. I mean, talk about the urban redevelopment potential. When all the storage that now goes to the parking lots and parking decks that now goes to storing cars, won't need those if that happens. So it'll be interesting. It'll have a huge impact on cities if that comes to the fore.
So I got a comment. I was driving back from Charlotte today and listening to the news, and there was a special on NPR about Stockholm, Sweden, and how it used to be complete gridlock there. But in the past, I can't remember, 5 or 10 years, they reduced that traffic jam was 2 cars because they increased taxes to come downtown,
Right.
toll, whatever.
Congestion pricing, right?
Yeah, and so there's no congestion. Everybody takes public transit. But then at the end of the comment, it's something I've always kind of had in my mind is, well, that's a medieval European city that was based around, grid and, pre-car years. But
Right.
now we have our American cities that are based around the car. What do you do about that? Because we've already kind of, for instance, bus routes aren't set up for a Greenville necessarily, or, LA.
Really? I don't think I can talk any louder than that. Anyway, so my point was how European cities are set up more for public transit. What do we do about the American city now that's based upon the car? How do you take that back?
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. I think that, again, using Greenville as an example, kind of this renaissance of the downtown, more and more people your age, they want to be where the action is, and they want to live in cities. And so it'll be interesting to see what becomes of the suburbs as we know them. I think we'll still have them, but it could be more expensive to live there and more attractive. We've got a lot of work. I mean, Greenville's, one of the great models and leaders in this, but there are a lot of cities that could stand to be redeveloped.
I'll have one last comment to that.
Yeah.
Is it affordability to live downtown in any American downtown is through the roof.
It's just the affordability of it?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, back to your earlier point about in Stockholm, you said, I know a lot of cities have done this in Europe. New York actually considered it, this congestion pricing, where they charge you a toll to basically drive into the city. London did it famously, and they use the money from the toll and they plow that back into a public transit system that makes it more convenient and easier. And so a lot of cities, and the congestion disappears. And that's an example of the strategy that I mentioned earlier. So we've had this strategy, and we continue to have this strategy of we're going to try to solve the congestion problem by increasing the supply of asphalt. It's like someone funny person said, it's like trying to solve obesity by loosening your belt. That doesn't work. But I think if we can rethink that, maybe figure out, well, how can we promote a strategy that seeks to reduce the demand for asphalt, either by building beautiful cities or, having some transit options like we used to. Let's enable this kind of innovation. Let's see where it can go and really discuss that. To your question about affordable housing, it's a tough one because, and it's going to get tougher because as this interest in living in urban areas, as the demand for that increases, if we have a limited supply, what happens, right? The price goes up. So, ultimately, I think the answer is we got to increase the supply. And that's hard to do given our, we can get Neil Robinson up here to talk about battling zoning and these kind of NIMBY issues that you go through. But I think we need to have a discussion, like a adult conversation, and not just kind of emotional NIMBYism that we have too often. And you students here, Robert said that the average age is 25. You know, when I first met Charles Frazier, he was 25. And Jim Light and Jim Chafin, they were in their mid-20s. And I think Mrs. Frazier, Laura Lawton, wasn't Mr. Frazier about 25 when he started Sea Pines? It was something like that. So it's up to y'all. Y'all going to have to figure this out. Another question? Yes?
Can we have our downtown and the cores of our city free from cars? It's beautiful to travel through the Battery area of Charleston by just walking through the place or through horse carriages rather than moving by cars. Do we have to have cars in our downtowns?
I mean, they didn't for most of Charleston's history, right? Charleston was settled, that map I showed you was 1680, and it wasn't until, and even in the 20s, that very few people had cars, and you have the streetcar system, and it worked. Population was close to double what it is now. But it's one of those things, it's a challenge, because, you know, it's like this balance. I think you get to a tipping point. You have, you know, where does it flip over and you stop needing your car as much? But there are numerous strategies. You know, we don't have, I mean, we could have, I mean, think about when you go to the Atlanta airport or any airport, right? You don't go and drive your car next to gate B6 and get on the plane. You park somewhere else, and then you walk or you take transit in. Same thing in Venice. You know, you don't go park in St. Mark's Square. You park in a giant parking lot, or you take the train or gondola in. At Disney World, you know, you don't go drive down and park next to Cinderella's castle, do you? You park on some giant parking lot, and then you take transit in. So we can apply the same kind of thinking. We don't have to have our tourists all come in and clog up the streets.
In spirit of your sort of introduction as a conversation, I think there's some really interesting, and I would say courageous, because it really does take a very strong political effort to kind of challenge the transportation industry. And so Michael Bloomberg, you know, he took a couple days and closed off 42nd Street in downtown New York. It was wonderful. Everybody was walking around. I was in Jakarta, Indonesia, last year, and the mayor of Jakarta, who's now the president of the country, he decided every Sunday we're going to close off the main street in downtown Jakarta, and now it's kind of like people biking and festivals and music playing every Sunday. It's wonderful. You know, congestion pricing is another thing that people have pushed forward to kind of experiment with exactly what you're saying. So, so yeah, it's being done, and I think what Vince is saying is that young people need to be sort of pushing for these things as well.
Thanks. Anyone else? All right, thanks again.